November 24th, 1326, the town square of Hereford, England, is suffocating with people. Nobles wrapped in fine cloaks stand shoulder to shoulder, with clergymen clutching rosaries. Tradesmen, soldiers, peasants, every corner is crammed with bodies. An expectant roar hums across the air. They have all gathered for one reason: to watch the downfall of a man once untouchable. A wooden scaffold towers above them, and at its center, the guards drag forward a hollow-faced man in his early 40s. His cheeks are sunken, his skin pale, his body weakened from deliberate starvation. He has been refusing food for days in a desperate attempt to die before this day could come. His clothes, once the richest silks in the kingdom, hang in filthy tatters, and yet the crowd knows exactly who he is. Just a few years ago, this same man had been the second most powerful figure in England, the closest companion to King Edward II. Now he is about to be executed in one of the most gruesome ways ever staged in England. His name is Hugh Despenser the Younger, the king's favorite, his confidant, and to many, his lover. Within hours, his body will be torn apart before the cheering masses, transformed from noble lord into a spectacle of public vengeance. But how did it come to this? How did a man born into privilege, who climbed into the heart of royal power, end up condemned to a death so savage that even medieval chroniclers wrote about it with horror? To understand, the story must rewind through years of ambition, scandal, and betrayal that left England shaken to its core. Hugh Despenser the Younger was born around 1286 into one of England's most prominent families. His father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, was a trusted servant of the mighty King Edward I. His mother, Isabel de Beauchamp, came from the powerful line of the Earls of Warwick. In short, Hugh had every advantage: noble blood, access to court, education, and connections that many could only dream of. From the start, his destiny was bound to the crown. Everything changed in 1307 when Edward II ascended to the throne. The new king already carried a reputation that unsettled the nobility. His deep affections for male companions were no secret. His first great favorite, Piers Gaveston, became infamous for arrogance and disregard toward the realm's barons. Gaveston flaunted his influence with the king, mocking the nobility and angering even the most patient lords. In 1312, the barons snapped. Gaveston was captured and brutally executed, his head stuck on a spike as proof that the nobility would not tolerate such unchecked favoritism. But power abhors a vacuum, and soon someone had to fill the void beside the king. That someone was Hugh Despenser. By 1316, Hugh had wormed his way into Edward's inner circle. He was granted the position of royal chamberlain, giving him constant private access to the king. Their bond grew close, and whispers quickly followed. Hugh's marriage to Eleanor de Clare, the king's niece, secured his influence even further, granting him vast lands and the powerful lordship of Glamorgan in Wales. Hugh was no longer just a courtier, he was a rising shadow over England. And Hugh was ambitious, far too ambitious. His appetite for power and wealth knew no limit. With Edward's favor, he began confiscating estates across England and Wales, stripping lands from rivals, widows, even his own in-laws. He manipulated the law to enrich himself at every turn. His greed was blatant, his corruption brazen. Enemies multiplied swiftly. By 1321, the barons had once again had enough. They rebelled. For a brief moment, it seemed Hugh's story might end there. He was exiled. Cast from the kingdom, he had bled dry. But Hugh was not a man who faded quietly into the background. In exile, he turned to piracy, raiding English merchant ships, still clinging to power through violence and ruthlessness. And fortune once again turned in his favor. By 1322, Edward II had regained control over the rebellious barons. With victory secured, the king recalled Hugh. Not only was Hugh back, he returned stronger and more ruthless than before. From 1322 to 1326, the Despensers, father and son, did not simply serve the crown, they were the crown. Hugh the Younger controlled access to Edward, dictated royal policy, and ruled as though England itself was his personal estate. Chroniclers like Jean Froissart described Hugh as king in all but name, and it was no exaggeration. Yet whispers of scandal dogged him. Rumors spread that Hugh's relationship with Edward II was not just political, but intimate. Yes, Hugh had a wife and children, but the gossip of sodomy with the king poisoned his reputation. In the eyes of medieval society, such charges were more than scandalous. They were deadly. The church considered same-sex intimacy a grave sin, an affront to nature and God. Truth mattered less than perception, and the perception was damning. Hugh was not only greedy, corrupt, and ruthless, he was morally corrupt in the eyes of his enemies. The whispers traveled through castles and taverns alike, repeated in hushed tones that grew louder with every telling. Nobles who already despised him found fresh ammunition to turn others against him. Commoners, angry over lost lands and crushing taxes, seized on the rumors as proof of divine judgment waiting to fall. Even those uncertain of the truth knew that the accusation alone was enough to stain Hugh's legacy forever. In a society where honor was everything, to be branded a sinner against nature was to be cast outside the bounds of humanity itself. The gossip, whether fact or fabrication, wrapped around Hugh like chains, tightening with each passing year until his downfall became not only political, but personal, moral, and spiritual. And among those enemies was Queen Isabella, wife of Edward II. Once respected as the daughter of the King of France, Isabella had been pushed aside and humiliated by Hugh's domination of the court. He stripped her of her lands, jailed her household, and even went so far as to take her children from her custody and give them into the care of his own wife, Eleanor. For Isabella, this was unforgivable. The queen had endured enough. In 1325, Isabella traveled to France under the pretense of negotiating peace. But in Paris, she found more than diplomacy. She met Roger Mortimer, a powerful English baron who had escaped the Tower of London after clashing with Edward and the Despensers. Mortimer and Isabella became lovers and soon co-conspirators. Their goal was simple: destroy Hugh and topple Edward. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer returned to England, not with an overwhelming army, but with a small band of mercenaries. They didn't need more. The nobility, starved under Hugh's greed, flocked to their banner. Support for Edward evaporated almost overnight. Edward, Hugh, and Hugh the Elder fled west with the royal treasury, but they were fugitives now, clinging to scraps of power. The Despensers split up, desperate to survive. Hugh the Elder was captured in Bristol and given no mercy. Still in his armor, he was hanged, beheaded, and quartered, his remains tossed aside like scraps for the dogs. Meanwhile, Edward and Hugh the Younger fled deeper into Wales, but the noose was tightening. Abandoned by allies, they were finally captured near Neath. The king was taken into custody, destined to lose his crown to his young son, the future Edward III. But Hugh's fate was far darker. Dragged back across the border, skeletal from starvation, Hugh was hauled before a tribunal in Hereford. His enemies, led by Isabella and Mortimer, presided over the trial. The charges were extensive: treason, theft, extortion, corruption, and the manipulation of the king. But the trial was a farce. The verdict had been decided long before Hugh stood in the dock. He was guilty, and his sentence would be nothing short of spectacle. On the morning of November 24th, The people poured into the market square. This was not simply an execution. It was theater, a public catharsis. Hugh was tied to a ladder so that every pair of eyes could witness his fall. A crown of nettles was shoved onto his head to mock the power he had once wielded beside Edward. Verses from the Bible were scrawled across his bare flesh, condemning arrogance and sin. Then came the torment. According to chroniclers like Jean Froissart, Hugh's genitals were cut off and thrown into a fire before his eyes. The symbolism was deliberate, a punishment crafted to condemn the whispers of sodomy with Edward II. The crowd roared with approval, some laughing, others howling for more. Still alive, Hugh was disemboweled. His entrails slowly pulled out and burned as the air echoed with a scream unlike any other. Witnesses described it as inhuman, a sound that haunted them. Finally, after long, drawn-out torture, Hugh was hanged. Even then, humiliation was not complete. His body was beheaded and quartered, his limbs sent across England as warnings, his head mounted on a spike at London's gates. The cruelty of Hugh's execution was no accident. It was crafted as moral theater. His castration was not only to inflict pain but to shame, to destroy not just his body but his legacy. He had been accused of corrupting the natural order, manipulating royal power, and violating sacred bonds. His punishment was designed to erase him. 4 years later, in 1330, his widow Eleanor was allowed to collect the scattered remnants of his body. What was left was pitiful: a head, a thigh bone, and a few fragments. That was all that remained of the man who once ruled England from behind the throne. As for Edward II, his fate was scarcely kinder. In September 1327, less than a year after Hugh's execution, Edward died under mysterious circumstances at Berkeley Castle. The most infamous tale claimed that a red-hot poker was thrust into his body, leaving no external wounds but ensuring a death soaked in symbolic cruelty. Whether true or not, the rumor reflected the same theme: humiliation, vengeance, and erasure. But fate has a way of turning. Isabella and Mortimer, triumphant in Hugh's destruction, soon met their own downfall. In 1330, the young Edward III seized power. Mortimer was executed. Isabella pushed aside into quiet house arrest. The wheel of power in medieval England spun fast, crushing one generation of favorites after another. And yet, Hugh Despenser's story still lingers. In modern times, he's been remembered as one of the greatest villains of the 14th century, a man consumed by greed and ambition. But historians remind us that not all charges were fair. In the brutal politics of the Middle Ages, accusations of sodomy were weapons, designed not for truth, but for shame and political advantage. Hugh's corruption and ruthlessness may have been real, but the sexual rumors that fueled his destruction were as much about strategy as morality. What his story reveals most is the nature of medieval justice. Executions were not simply punishments. They were performances, choreographed to cleanse society of perceived sins. For Hugh, each stage of torture, castration, disembowelment, hanging, beheading, was symbolism etched in blood. His body became the message. This is what happens to those who overreach, who seize too much, who blur the line between personal desire and royal authority. From privileged boy to shadow ruler, from king's companion to mutilated traitor, Hugh Despenser's story endures because it is more than just one man's fall. It is a mirror of power's dangers, of ambition unchecked, of politics entwined with intimacy. His bones may have long since turned to dust, but the warning carved into his flesh still whispers through history. Power is never free, and history never forgets. So if the rise and fall of Hugh Despenser the Younger has gripped your imagination, remember this: history is filled with tales just as dramatic, just as brutal, and just as revealing about the human hunger for power. Stick around, because there are many more stories waiting to be told. And if this story kept you hooked, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss the next one.